Hello everyone, today we talk about innovations of artisan work during the Middle Ages. Just a point observing a couple of innovations and improvements that were carried out at the time, the very end of the Middle Ages, between let's say the 14th and the 15th century especially, that really paved the road even for further developments and contributed to making Europe uh, expand and grow ever faster, always considering that, as we often say on Schwerpunkt, the Middle Ages had been chiefly a period of growth and of expansion. Expansion, especially in the West, strictly meant, and just towards, however, these last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages, there is an acceleration, which is what brings to what we know as the modern age, like the starting point, right, of many things we consider as to live in direct continuation to, but that effectively were still part of a medieval world. The modern age is essentially a consequence of medieval world, much more than actually the medieval world was a consequence of the ancient one. It's important to stress because the ancient world ended up in a contraction, right? In a crisis. The Middle Ages transitioned into the modern age with a great growth and expansion, as we have said, and this should always be borne in mind. So we can definitely observe that overall the main development of Europe occurred chiefly, in fact, with what we call the modern age, and especially the 15th and the 16th century at that point, and that previously the growth had kind of been kind of slower. But in general, we cannot obscure the fact that in certain fields, especially of production, are observable in these last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages important progress in in the technique fundamentally. In glass making, for example, the procedures of making that existed, for example, among the workers of Murano in Venice were spread in other regions such as Bohemia, for example, with considerable improvement of glass and crystals, and the first ones all ever more used for windows and for objects of domestic use. And important novelties were introduced also in the field of mining and metallurgy. After the 13th century development and the relative stagnation of the following one, there was, starting from the mid 15th century, a strong expansion, especially in mining, that invested also the first decades of the 16th century. Particularly important was the increase in silver production and of iron. On the mountains of Tolfa in the High Lazio began the exploitation of alum. Alum was particularly important for tannery, and the Italians, chiefly the Genoese, extracted it from Lesbos, right, that had a very rich vein. And this is how the Byzantine Empire actually had paid the Genoese for making them reconquer great parts of the Aegean against the Venetians, and that was the most important center. So here instead, in central Italy, you find new veins that are found, for which there is also a great, struggle, in the sense that naturally there were private domains, that where this alum could be extracted, that the papacy and other major families of Rome wanted to seize it. So it's interesting even in terms of local history. But there were many other improvements. The invention, for example, of the blast furnace that allowed to achieve iron production through two distinct operations, because in the past only one was contemplated, and reducing also the waste of material and obtaining two diversely refined products, such as cast iron, for example, that was obtained through the casting of the blasting furnace and eventually melted and worked for the production of iron. Needless to say, iron production was particularly important for armor production, but also for artillery now and cannonballs. Right, major problem. The idea of the blasting furnace is it can burn at higher temperatures, so you can obtain a better result. And in the past, other areas of the world had been specialized. The main problem was actually, putting air into it. So these blasting furnaces worked through hydraulic pumps that pumped oxygen into it, and this also in turn, as we will see now, was another technological improvement of the time that had allowed it. In other countries, for example, think about Woods steel in India. If you wonder how they made it, this is essentially because of the monsoons. Literally, they had this natural way of channeling a lot of wind, which is very regular and constant in India during a certain part of the year, of course, in one direction than another, and that could insufflate more air, right? So this in turn allowed to melt iron at higher temperatures and to work it more effectively, getting better steel, etc. So naturally, this starts being a real problem also in terms of quantity, right? It's not just the technology in itself, it's also about needing the stuff and needing ever better quality and uniformation, because at the end of the day it was also a matter of durability, but also of relying on ever more homogeneous pieces that could at that point give a better scientificity, let's say, to the employment of the various weapons. Also, armor production was particularly important. Milan specifically was specializing in selling, Milanese armor, basically selling it all over Europe for centuries, even during the early modern age. Glass making, actually not just in Venice but also in Milan, was present. So these areas were definitely on the lead, and the surely starting from the 14th century, and especially also in Italy once again, but also in other regions of France, for example, there was the ever larger use of hydraulic energy, as we've seen before, that had originated actually in large parts, at least, for the production of paper. Think about paper mills, the presses, and so on, that paper, as you know, had substituted parchment progressively. Yeah, it was kind of more, it perished more quickly, but at least it was much cheaper. And this technology had come from China through the Arabs and to Muslim Spain, then eventually from there mills in places like Valencia, etc. And from there into Italy, that once again also is the country where this is specialized eventually in production, then spread throughout all of Europe. And the spread of paper was quite important because it was a much more convenient writing support, let's say, that would have had, however, its full development, enhancement, let's say, towards the mid-15th century, with the invention of the printing press from the goldsmith Johann Gutenberg from Mainz in Franconian Rhineland. That this was an invention which we made a video actually about Gutenberg and other important figures, because at this time actually men of knowledge were also interested in typography, in how effectively books were now organized, even in their pages, in the writing system. So this went in parallel with lots of other needs and improvements that in the case of the printing press are self-evident. I mean, the concept is based on the fabrication of mobile characters in metal that presents very clear connections with the by the way, with the progress achieved with the techniques of melting with the blasting furnace and so on. So as you see, these are just a bunch of examples that, however, show you how these systems were all interconnected. I mean, there was a spin-off that overlapped over all these fields, and this shows you also how Europe was really expanding on its own in a continuous stream since the previous centuries, and how these inventions, let's say, or innovations, because also it's difficult to say when certain things had been discovered first. I mean, hydraulic energy is there since ever. Like even the Romans, even the Mesopotamians had water mills, right? But here it's a matter of really having at disposal more resources, having centralized powers that can invest more structurally in the development of a certain technology. At this time, everything is actually largely autonomous, right? But even the governments are interested in developing these techniques as assets, right, that they could use on their own, right? It's not surprising that here we mention chiefly Italy and Germany, also certain regions of France that objectively were the most advanced at the time, right? If you see even the spread of the printing press all over Germany, I mean, it was very fast. Even in Italy, it was very fast. I mean, there was evidently a substratum of politics and society was ready to receive this and to make it blossoming, let's say, and making a profitable use of it. And which is to say that, as we always say it on Schwerpunkt at this point, at the risk also of sounding boring, but it's always worth to remember it, that it's not technology that changes the thing, it's society that creates the technology, because society is ready to have it, right? And these technological improvements come simply along with that, right? And it's that simple, and that's how Europe evolved and transitioned. And that's why at the beginning of the video we were saying, what is that is typically medieval or is typically ancient or modern. There's actually nothing about it. It's all about politics and society, and how they're in economics, of course, and how they interact, and they are able to produce this. And Europe in this regard is being probably favored by what is considered in part as a failure by some, or at least maybe are more keen maybe of an ancient history. They look at these big empires, they look at 15th century Europe, they see basically an all fragmented situation. Yes, there is the Kingdom of France, of England, even Spain is dynastically unified, but the rest is, there is Poland, there's Hungary, there are big chunks, but they're still pretty unstable, right? Even France and England, that are more the best structured systems, are still, France has, just come out of 100 Years' War and is putting itself together once again. England instead is thrown into disarray because of the loss of the 100 Years' War. And therefore you see actually that it's the most fragmented areas, politically speaking, the Holy Roman Empire chiefly, Germany, Italy, that are on the lead, technologically speaking. And it is very meaningful because it's been explained as a essentially proto-capitalistic phenomenon that is that has to do with the preservation of resources, essentially their the sectorization of assets. Like even this is beautifully exemplified even with the Ottoman invasion of Europe that is taking place here at this point in the Balkans. And you see that aside the obvious limits even that this expansionism had, like at the time, for any power of the time. Actually, um, the Ottomans would have never gotten to the river Thames, right? you know, but the uh, what I'm trying to say here is that in spite major chunks of Europe collapsed. Think about Hungary. Think about all the other Balkanic, principalities, etc. Um, let's say, the system was able to absorb that expansion to, in a way, also to many people took refuge in the West, famously enough, from the Byzantine world. A lot of Greek scholars and scientists and men of letters came in the West. They contributed deeply to the development of the renaissance of humanism that was already there, but that, thanks to this context, was definitely enriched, etc. And this allowed, in many ways, as a fragmented system, to preserve better locally resources, to manage them better. Like, the idea is that if you have an enormous empire, physically speaking, this is actual physics, you are losing more energy to do certain things than if you, in proportion, of course, in relative terms, then you are a smaller power. And this can maybe go a little bit in contradiction with what we said before regarding the need for centralization. In fact, certain techniques were actually their improvement to their to the centralization of power, yes, but at the same time we see that these large powers get that technology from countries that were not powers on their own, right? All the various German and Italian, let's say, small states, we can say, and this is particularly important because it means also that this system is integrated. Like, this is not like all chunks of Europe scattered here and there. I mean, especially during humanism and the Renaissance, there is the construction of a truly, at least of a culture that encompasses the whole Europe as we know it. And it's not surprising that the concept of modern Europe, in fact, is born, and of Western civilization is being born, like, acknowledged as such, culturally speaking, in the modern age, right? Before that, in the Middle Ages, the concept of Europe was not strictly culturally meant. I mean, essentially, Europeans considered themselves chiefly as Christians, and therefore the world revolved around Jerusalem and Rome, and this broader. Yeah, there was the obvious realization there was a shared space. Humanism can be found in European culture, since we talk even about 12th century humanism and so on. You can see these roots back in Carolingian times, which I see, especially from a strictly in terms of literary and in this sense narrowly cultural point of view. But it's something that can, of course, have its roots back in the ancient world for many times. But that at this point, it's the Europeans start focusing on, because they objectively realize that they are something different. They have become to develop a civilization that has certain shared characters, and that has been intensifying, let's say, in terms of shared values and technologies and ideas and thoughts, exactly in this period, right? At the beginning of the Middle Ages, there was nothing such as Europe, culturally speaking. There were many different influxes and many different, let's say, local, provincial realizations of the world, of how one people essentially lived in one place, and albeit they knew that there was someone else out there, they didn't have, their horizons were focused chiefly in there. This is typical, especially of early medieval times, and especially of Central and Northern Europe in part, but this is also maybe not true, because it depends. Trade and traffic, transcontinental commerce was always there. If you look at the Vikings, if you look the previous times, even the thing was probably more obvious in the Mediterranean, but in this regard, let's say, we can say that medieval world worked as an incredibly homogenizer of European culture, and this is very, very important. At the end of the Middle Ages, it's there, right? What deeply contributed to the realization of a Western civilization was the same Ottoman threat. I mean, objectively, we owe an enormous lot to our idea of modern Europe to the Ottomans, because if there hadn't been the Ottomans, that opened space, that open frontier in the West, that with no actual border and no actual limit, would have remained open. Like Christendom of course existed even within the Ottoman Empire, and this quite floridly in some cases. So the Ottomans, however, become the enemy, like the ones that are directly threatening the political and territorial unity of Christianity in Europe, and this brings this narrow, let's say, narrowly Western identity to be shaped. Like, and this is a story that has a great import. It's different also in different countries of Europe. Like in Central Europe, it had a different meaning that it had, I don't know, in Italy or in Eastern Europe. It's somewhat different. There were countries like France that were actually allied with the Ottomans, that backed them against the Habsburgs and so on. So the thing, as always, is very complicated. But when we look at this period, we can't avoid to recognize that the Ottomans aided to define this, and there were also massive intersections. Like, much of what our modern Europe is directly comes in part from the Ottoman Empire, and vice versa, because the Ottomans actually were way, let's say, probably more westernized by Westerners than the Ottomans influencing Western Europe, as a matter of fact, because the Ottomans were objectively and this is especially evident when you compare them with other powers like the ones in Egypt or Persia. They were massively westernized, like, and since their very origins. But anyhow, the militarized frontier of the Balkans, of the Mediterranean, with the Sublime Gate, brought to a rationalization and territorialization of the concept of the West, of the modern West as we know it, and this was a crucial moment that we will of course keep discussing and observing in many other videos, hopefully. And this was just about a little bit about technology. And alright, so this was short. Maybe we should get a bit more detailed in on average on this technological videos, but maybe we can do it in others, as some of you have rightfully said that these videos are kind of long, but I don't mind personally. It's just that I don't study history of technology that much as such. Like, I constantly read about it, but I don't, I'm not an expert strictly meant. But there are a bunch of concepts that essentially end up repeating every time, and that I think are important anyhow, because there are misconceptions regarding how also technology, society, economics work, and especially there is this radical prejudice about the Middle Ages as the moment where not much actually changed. I mean, in terms especially of positivistic idea of progress and of modernity, as if the Middle Ages were just a black flat land where there was nothing, and all of a sudden here the Renaissance pops out, right? And this can't be supported anymore, and we should effectively discriminate whoever still owns such ideas. That I can assure you, if you go to a university, proclaim certain things, you can't even pass the very first exams of medieval history. So but this is my usual rant about that there are modernistic prejudices. I must say, in the last year or so, and as starting to talk also about modern history in part, not just in the manualistic way I do, like with videos like this for medieval history, but talking also a bit about military I mean, political military history, and as we've seen yesterday, for example, with the improvement of military logistics and cartography, well, you do feel a lot this sense of continuity with the, let's say, between the Middle Ages and actually much closer times to than one we to us than what we used to think. I'm personally, like, if you are curious about my view, to me the Middle Ages ended as an ancien regime as such in 1918. That's where the Middle Ages objectively end, especially militarily speaking. And I'm not kidding. And many people say, "But how can you say that?" Yes, because we have a flawed um, um, view of the Middle Ages as such. I mean, we stereotype the Middle Ages chiefly through modernistic prejudices, technologistic prejudice, and therefore to us the Middle Ages is those stinky, crumbling castles and weird, unwieldy knights covered in plate armor doing strange things. That's our Middle Ages, right? Normally, and then the beautiful modern age occurs, but that's a strictly technologistic view of history, and I found out it's actually very very widespread. Maybe I don't know. Maybe it's also because I was I mean I've always been fairly aware of that this was not the case, even when I was a child, etc. But that's a view that you often get. This idea of extreme progress that has to be enforced in civilization, for which otherwise that we can't talk about culture or achievements or whatever. That the achievements of civilizations do not stand in largely in technological inventions. They stand in all what rendered them possible, which is a very different thing. And that if you take these standards of judgment objectively, you get that the Middle Ages actually lasted much longer, but way longer, up to the last century fundamentally, than we think. And this is maybe something I will discuss on another occasion, because I realize that these are statements that need a better explanation, but we will get it, I think, chiefly through military history than these ones, because here we mostly make exemplificative videos about in general this little pills of manualistic history. But okay, so for now we'll stop here, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.